You know, One Piece is a really crazy story when you think about it. I mean, you have the main characters going from island to island all over the world. They're seeing these fantastical locations like sky islands and underwater islands. And on top of that, you have all these unique fantasy races like giants and dwarves and fishmen and mermaids. And on top of all that, you have an insane power system where not only can people turn into animals, but they can also turn into elements like fire, lightning. They can control earthquakes, and they can even turn into a jacket. But out of all of those crazy and unique powers, the main character has rubber. He is rubber, I should say, actually. But why is that? As anime's gone and grown and been like one of the biggest things ever in the last decade or so, it's not too uncommon to see main characters have obscure powers. Some people can do very weird things just to make their shows more unique. But you have to remember that One Piece came out in 1997, back when it was like cool to have, just fire power, lightning powers, be a cool swordsman. So why did Oda choose his main character to have rubber? Now, there's obviously the thematic reason of Luffy being able to bounce back from anything, which is, very important to his character. And yeah, that is, the integral parts of the themes of One Piece that you understand. But how does this work in application? I think Oda is a very creative person, to say the least, as we go off the introduction of the video. But not only is he creative, but he created a creative character to which he can express his creativity too. Because yeah, he could create, a main character that can control lightning or could have no powers and defy the odds. We've seen plenty of examples of this, like Kobe, Garp, Shanks. But he chose his main character to have this stretchy ability, and not only does he have that ability, but he chooses to draw him in all these crazy and expressive ways. So this is all to say that I think that at Luffy's core is creativity and imagination on top of bouncing back from everything. Now, if you've seen the title of this video and the thumbnail, you already know what I'm going to be getting into. The reason why I'm making this video, though, is because I feel like a lot of people still don't fully understand what Oda is trying to convey through his character of Luffy. A lot of people probably still feel like, Gear 5 was an asshole, or Luffy is showing things that he's never shown before. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. From day one, Luffy's powers never made sense. We just tried to justify them. I think one of the funniest things the One Piece community has done as a whole is turn themselves into some sort of scientists when we saw Luffy's powers on display in multiple times in the story, and we tried to justify it because in our minds we had no idea what was going on, and because we didn't want to critique the story from taking all these weird turns, we tried to be like, no, there's an actual scientific application to all the things Luffy's doing, so it makes perfect sense. Oda's great at writing. Now, this is not a critique of Oda in any way. I genuinely think this is what he was planning from the start. A lot of times when we give Oda praise or we criticize Oda, sometimes I feel like we probably do a little bit too much of one or the other. We might be like, there's no way he planned that, or there's like this, he absolutely planned this from day one. This is one of those times where I want to be like, I think Oda genuinely planned this from day one because it fits too perfectly for it to not. But basically, starting from Enies Lobby on, Luffy started exhibiting new types of powers, which was Gear Second, Gear Third, and then eventually we got to Gear Fourth and then Gear Fifth eventually. I don't think there's going to be a Gear 6, by the way. I think Luffy's hit his peak. I remember my first time seeing Gear Second, and I was absolutely blown away. It felt like One Piece entered a whole new level, new stage, and that's what I think Oda was trying to convey in that scene, because it really did elevate the story to a whole new level. Luffy himself moved up, and you could feel that. But at the same time, you're like, wait, what is he doing? What just happened? And then you get, I think Oda threw us off with this too. We get a scientific explanation for this. He's like, yeah, he's pumping the blood in his body faster so that he can, like use more energy to speed up his heart and get faster and stronger at the same time. And in our heads, we're like, okay, I guess that makes sense. It kind of, I guess, I was like 13 when I was watching that, so it didn't make too much sense to me, but, it's science. I'm going to argue it's science. And I think from that point on, we confused ourselves. We just went, straight delusional anytime Luffy did anything. It's like, oh, there's got to be a scientific explanation for this because Oda's a genius. He would never steer us in the wrong way. Now, when you really think about it, yeah, it's anime and cartoon logic does play a big part in it, but at the same time, you want to understand why things happen the way they do. You can't just pull things out of thin air like Luffy does later on, and then be like, yeah, that makes sense because it's the cartoon. Why think about it? So I think it's very important to understand that, like, while there are technically explanations for these things that Luffy is doing, so you can be like, you can be in the comments, be like, yeah, no, that's not an imagination. This is why he does that. Yeah, those things are explained, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily make sense in a practical application sense. Granted, there are other things in the story that are crazy. For example, Sanji being able to light his body on fire canonically, and Zoro pulling demons out of his body canonically because other people are able to see them. But these things do get explained in a way. For example, Sanji having a Germa body, it's an artificial body, and Zoro using Ashura as like a manifestation of his conqueror's hockey. So he's literally like imposing his willpower. Now, does that one make too much sense? Not necessarily, but I think the main point here is what I'm trying to get across is that, like, even though there's an explanation, it doesn't take away from the fact that this is something Luffy imagined. It's not like every user of the Gomu Gomu no Mi has, besides the Nika transformation, which we'll get into last, it's not like the next level of a Gomu Gomu user is gear second and then gear third and gear fourth. It's not like it's not like Super Saiyan. What it actually is, it's the users. What it actually is the user's creativity allowing them to express themselves in different ways. So if someone else was to have the Gomu Gomu no Mi, they could probably have a whole new set of powers because that's how they choose to express their creativity. And I know this is the case because there are plenty of people who have come up with their own concepts for gears. I remember when Gear 4 first got announced. I forget if there was a break that week. I can imagine that there was, maybe there wasn't, right? And for like that whole week or two, people were coming up with like a million ways that Gear 4 was gonna look and the application of it. If you're an OG One Piece fan, you'll remember the image. I might be able to pull it up here. But it was basically Gear 4 was gonna be Luffy hitting himself and storing that energy to have like an explosive power that's like really fast. That's what like everyone thought it was gonna be, right? So that very application alone, if someone else was to have the Gomu Gomu no Mi, that might be their version of gear second, third, or fourth. You just never know because it's about creativity, right? Now, moving on to gear third, this one was very interesting, right? Because we also got a scientific explanation for it. We got an explanation that Gear Third was Luffy blowing air into his bones to make himself hit enemies harder and with a giant fist. And at the end of it, he would turn super mini because blowing air into your bones after the air leaves would shrink your body. Yeah, all of that made complete sense. All of that was scientific, right? None of that was imagination based, right? But think about it this way. Not only, and this is something that if you watch any other YouTuber who breaks down powers, if they talk about Gear Third, they'll tell you bones don't work that way. We don't have just one super bone in our body. Our bones have joints and they're connected in pieces. So Luffy being able to like blow air into his thumb, and that first off, your bones aren't even hollow. So you'd have to have a hollow super bone where you're able to pass the air around. None of that made sense. So in actuality, first of all, Luffy wasn't even at a certain point. Luffy stopped blowing air into his body. Like the first couple times he did it, he would literally like for like a minute he would like blow air into his body. But after a while, he just started biting his thumb, and it started working automatically. Like, granted, it's an anime, so for dramatic effect, they're speeding it up. They don't want you to have to see that every time. That you can make that argument, but at the end of the day, it's still the fact that like Luffy imagined this power and he brought it into reality. So, with that being said, it's really hard for you to argue that Gear 5 is an asshole when he's showing these examples all throughout the story, and then it reaches its peak level where the fruit actually awakens. Now, that brings me to Gear 4. Now, he does the same thing in Gear Force because Gear Force, he blows the air to his muscles and he hardens them with armament hockey. That one is, I guess, a little bit more believable. Once again, air can't just travel through your muscles like that. That one has a little bit more understanding to it, but it still doesn't make sense, especially when it's like Luffy being able to fly. Like Doflamingo's explanation of this, he's like, "Oh yeah, you're turning the air around you into like you're making the air around you so elastic that you're able to bounce off of it, which allows you to fly." Doesn't make sense. Especially when we find out that like what Luffy's awakening does, where he is able to like manipulate his surroundings. So he's literally using the power right then and there. So because there's certain people that have devil fruit awakenings that are able to, like, for example, Katakuri, he can manipulate his surroundings when he's awakening, right? But he can still use mochi with or without the awakening. So Luffy is using rubber in that sense without using the awakening, I guess, if it makes sense. And that's just like another example of that. Another example, which is technically a use of gear second, not gear fourth. Also, and he might be no. I think he uses gear third. Okay, so in gear second and gear third, right, he can use Red Hawk and Red Rock. Now this goes all the way back to like when like over 10 years ago. I remember people were saying words like vulcanization and friction, right? So Luffy literally sets himself on fire, and he did that underwater. The first time we ever see Luffy use Red Hawk, he used it underwater. So that was even crazier that he lit his fist on he. So the explanation for that one was he whips his fist back so fast, and the friction between the rubber on his skin and the metallic substance of armament hockey, they rub together so fast that he literally sets his arm on fire, which people were like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But when you really think about it, especially underwater, it doesn't make sense. So Luffy literally imagined his arm on fire and it lit on fire. So that's another example of how Luffy's powers were always imagined based. So when you mix all of that together, you get Gear 5th. Now, we've never seen Luffy use any fire attacks in Gear 5th, but that's also probably because he probably doesn't want to. We've seen that he's able to manipulate his environment. We've seen him grab lightning, and we've seen him start to pull things out of thin air, like the goggles. And I think he turned the baseball bat from a tree, but he's able to pull things out of thin air. So I wanted to make this video basically because it's like Luffy's probably going to start showing us crazier and crazier things, and it would be wrong for it to, like, for people to say it's an ass pull when it's not. It's something that Oda has shown us from the beginning of the story, that Luffy's powers are always imagination based. That's just my opinion on that. That's how I'm interpreting the story. If you disagree, feel free to let me know in the comments why you feel like this is like bad writing or an ass pull. If you have anything to counter that, I'm always welcome to an open discussion about this. But yeah, this is day 2 of One Piece Day. We're dropping videos every single day this month. Hopefully, we're dropping videos every single day for the rest of my life because I'm trying to get paid off of this. I'm just rambling at this point. I don't even know if anyone's gonna watch this stuff, to be honest. But if you've made it all the way to the end of my rambling, thank you so much for watching. More content's coming on the way. I love you all. Goodbye.